we've had, obviously, a tremendous amount of talk about Black Lives Matter and their interruption of Bernie Sanders at Netroots Nation and then the subsequent interruption in Seattle. It has clearly not hurt Bernie Sanders. And I argued yesterday that, in fact, I believe it's helping Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is up now in New Hampshire, which is really a stunning turn of events. He is now leading Hillary Clinton in the poll taken by Franklin Pierce University and Boston Herald, 44 to 37%. I don't know. The margin of error is 4.7%. So he's outside of the margin of error. In March, the same poll showed Clinton leading 44% to 8%. Now, there's a caveat here. Bernie Sanders is going to do well in Iowa. He's going to do well in New Hampshire. He may win. I don't know if he will or not. I mean, we're too far out. He may win in those primaries. They are primaries to which Bernie Sanders is very well suited. Overwhelmingly white. And we have another problem, I think, with primaries that's indicative of that, particularly on the Democratic side. It makes a lot more sense, I guess, if you're a Republican, because that's who your party looks like. Although I would say the party is far more conservative than even in Iowa, all white New Hampshire. Much more so. But nevertheless, in terms of Democrats, that's not indicative of who you need to win a Democratic nomination. Now, South Carolina, on the other hand, where you have a much larger African-American population, that's going to be the big test for Bernie Sanders. And then you go to the Nevada caucus, also not so lily white. And then you move on to the sort of the multi-state primaries. But if Bernie Sanders is going to actually win, he's not going to do so unless he wins in South Carolina. That's the bottom line. I guess it's considerable. I guess it's possible he could win South Carolina, lose South Carolina, win in Nevada, but then he's up against Hillary Clinton's money when you talk about multi-state primaries. So I think that Bernie Sanders is very much helped by Black Lives Matter because it has basically said, look, you're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. You're going to have to pay attention to the concerns of people outside the states of Iowa and New Hampshire. Which is not to say that there aren't supporters of Black Lives Matter in those two states, broadly speaking. And so I think this has helped Bernie Sanders. And I think it's helped Black Lives Matter, frankly. Well, people think, well, you haven't done they didn't do Black Lives Matter any help by interrupting Bernie Sanders. I think that's demonstrably untrue. You can look at polling. You can look at what Bernie Sanders has done. Sunday morning, he comes out after that protest with a very specific plan on how to deal with the emergency within the black community of African Americans dying at the hands of police. So I don't buy that. However, it was announced yesterday by Lawrence Lessig, and I have always been a very big fan of Lawrence Lessig. I have interviewed him for years. I've followed his work. I've read his books. I can't remember what it was, if it was 8 years ago, 6 years ago. He essentially made a public announcement that he was no longer going to work on copyright reform. He is the one who developed Creative Commons, one of the guys. And Aaron Swartz is actually where I believe he met Aaron Swartz or first worked with him. And at one point, he said, I am going to turn my attention to the problem that we have in our democracy, which is the power of money. The idea that we had moved from a plutonomy to a plutocracy, where not only do we have massive wealth inequality and all the problems that come from that. But the subsidiary, or perhaps I should say, the even greater problem that is derived from that initial problem, that money has controlled our politics. And since the inception of this version of the Majority Report, that has been a clear and pronounced theme. I think one of the first guests we had on this program in November of 2010, maybe it was December, was the author of Winner Take All Politics. It was either Pierce or his co-author. I can't remember. Paul Pierce or I can't remember his co-author. And we've interviewed people like Martin Gillens, professor at Princeton, who has done study after study, which has shown that the policy preferences of the wealthy, if there's any controversy as to policy preferences between the rest of us and the extremely wealthy, it's the extremely wealthy whose policy preferences are supported by our lawmakers. And Lawrence Lessig has been working on this problem for years. In 2014, he started the Mayday PAC, which was to be a proof of concept where they would support, I believe at the time it was half dozen candidates in a nonpartisan fashion to support candidates who were looking to get money out of politics. And I'm not exactly sure how they measured that. If it was the support for taxpayer-financed elections or what it was. And aside from people taking a real issue with some of the choices that group made in terms of who they would support, like a Tea Partier who was supposedly challenging Scott Brown. Aside from that, I think by Lessig's own analysis, their concept failed. He, I think, said, the only thing I think he came away from is that there's clearly people who are interested in this issue enough to support the fundraising they did. And I was not as skeptical of that effort as many others, because I think this is a huge problem, and I can understand to a certain extent playing around, and maybe that's too dismissive, experimenting with the way to deal with this, because this is a very difficult nut to crack, right? How do you get people who have succeeded, by definition, with the campaign situation we have now and the finance situation that we have now, how do you get them to change the rules once they get in a way that may ultimately hurt them now that they're there? And I don't know that I know the answer. I am beginning to suspect more and more that it's going to have to be local. This is not going to be, and it's going to have to be even more localized than congressional races. In other words, you do it on a state by state, county by county, municipality by municipality level to build some measure of genuine grassroots support. And that is not the route that Lessig is going to follow. Lessig has announced yesterday, not that he's going to run necessarily, but rather that he is going to raise money, and if he raises $1 million within a certain period of time, he's going to run. And now understand, Bernie Sanders supports, as far as I know, every bit of Lessig's platform, explicitly. But according to Lessig, it's too far down on his list of priorities. It's number 10 on his website when it should be number 1. And Lessig says you can't do any of the things that Bernie Sanders wants to do unless you address number 10 on his list. Now, I don't agree with that analysis, at least wholeheartedly. I think it is a real structural problem. But nevertheless, I think what Lessig is doing for I believe the right reasons, is completely wrong. He is going to definitely hurt Bernie Sanders' chance of winning if he ends up running in the primary. If he is just trying to get the issue in the mainstream, I don't think that's going to happen either, frankly. I think Lawrence Lessig knows his limitations as a candidate. I hope he does. He stated in his video that he did, but they're real. And okay, he can raise $1 million. That's $1 million that wouldn't necessarily go to Bernie Sanders, but might. And frankly, I'd like to see that $1 million go to, I don't know, 2 big municipality races where someone who is pushing for tax-funded financing of campaigns maybe in that city or that county. And you build it that way. But if there's anybody out there who's complaining that Black Lives Matter is wrong because they're inhibiting Bernie Sanders' campaign, I hope you are throwing as much, if not more. Well, first of all, I would hope you're not throwing any sort of invectives at Black Lives Matter people, because I think it's really counterproductive, both for Bernie and for Black Lives Matter, frankly. But I think it's less counterproductive if you're going to throw that towards what Lawrence Lessig is doing, because I really do think that is a waste. I really do think that is a waste. And it's unfortunate. It really is unfortunate. Lawrence Lessig's, I just don't understand what the idea is here. He says he's going to run a referendum presidency. Yes, I've heard of that. People run for president all the time to deliver a message. Maybe he thinks he can get into the debates and offer that message. And that's not impossible to imagine, but highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. And it's simply going to cut into, I think, Bernie Sanders.